Bienvenue, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the 71st event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of Feminist and Social Justice Studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. I'm so excited to welcome you all. We have more upcoming events this semester. On January 23rd, we're hosting a historical queer music event in person at Turbo House as a fundraiser for Rock Camp Montreal. In addition to live musical performances, I'll be speaking about my new book, Ingredients for Revolution, and Kirsten Bescherda van Vliet will be talking about Montreal's queer music history. On January 25th, Dr. Sava Saheli Singh will screen her films on surveillance and give a talk. Later this semester, we will also welcome Indy Mitchell, Dr. Abiba Birhain, and Hannah Zevin, and Dr. Marika Seafor. Keep checking back on our website or follow us on Eventbrite, Facebook, or Twitter for more updates. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Mila Rekef, and more. So for tonight, we have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you may type your questions into the question and answer box. It's at the bottom of your screen there, and there will be some time during the second part of the event for Dr. Luke Stark to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we are grateful for the discussion that you generate. Thank you to our captioner for today, Michelle. As we welcome you into our homes and our offices through Zoom, and you welcome us into yours, let us be mindful of space and place. As many of you know, past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While many of the events this semester are virtual or hybrid, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. So as you know, the series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities, water protectors, and people involved in land back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you're on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. Now for today's event. Dr. Luke Stark is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University in London, Ontario. He researches the ethical, historical, and social impacts of computational technologies like artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning, ML. Stark is particularly animated by how these technologies mediate social and emotional expression and are reshaping, for better and worse, our relationship to labor, collective action, and each other. Stark's current book project, Ordering Emotion, Histories of Computing and Human Feelings from Cybernetics to AI, is a history of affective computing and the digital quantification of human emotion from 1950 cybernetics to today's social media platforms. I'm so excited for tonight's event. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Luke Stark. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to have such a wonderful audience. I see some familiar names on the participants list, which is great. I will start by offering my own land acknowledgement, which is to acknowledge that Western University and the land on which I'm speaking to you is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Chinongta nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be the home for a number of different Indigenous peoples, who I ask we recognize as contemporary stewards and vital contributors to our society here in London, Ontario. I respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as its original caretakers, and ask, as we've just been asked to acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples have endured in Canada, including the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and ongoing challenges in London, including high levels of homelessness and substance abuse. I pay respect to the elders of these nations, past, present, and future, and ask that we honor and respect these communities by accepting responsibility as public institutions to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service, and striving for restorative justice for Indigenous peoples and all those who have been marginalized and oppressed. As Alex put in her kind introduction, my work is multifaceted, but I'll be speaking to you today about my book project. I've added a re to the ordering, so I think I'm now going to call it reordering emotion: histories of computing and human feeling from cybernetics to AI. But just to give you a really quick overview of the things that I work on in general, my research looks at critical histories of computing and emotion and the sciences, fairness, ethics, and values in AI and digital media, and digital privacy and surveillance in everyday life. And I kind of teach and write across those areas. So, yeah, this presentation is part of a much longer and larger standing project of mine. Many of you may be familiar with, or some of you might be familiar with, on the history of human emotion as a subject of interest in AI, cybernetics, and computer science, from the present back to before any of those fields existed. I'm really hoping it's going to be out in 2024. If my editor from MIT Press is on the call, I'm working on it soon. And so I'm going to present this talk in a series of scenes. Scene one, right? The question, part one: where did these faces come from, and why do they matter? And in some ways, this was part of the genesis for this project. These faces appeared as I was finishing up my dissertation and trying to figure out, what I was doing with my work and with my life, and they, in some ways, crystallized some of the things I've been writing about into an actual existing technical form, right? So as you probably know, these are images of Facebook's reactions icons, right? They were launched for the site's then 2.1 billion active users in early 2016. And I would say that they're still the most widely used example of human emotion made legible to digital systems as data, as big data, right? Of course, Facebook is now not what it once was, but these are still, I think, the kind of probably pound for pound the most common. My suspicions about the significance of reaction icons were finally confirmed by some journalistic work, I think from just last year, right? When the Washington Post reported on information about how these reaction icons were used when they were introduced to the site, right? And what the reporters had discovered was that these various reaction icons were, meant that posts were weighted higher, in Facebook's initial algorithm when they were brought in 2016. So, so it meant that a heart was weighted, a post with a heart was weighted 5 times as much as one with a like. It also meant that a post with an angry reaction was rated 5 times as much as one with a like. And what a number of scholars and journalists have pointed to is how this kind of upvoting of negative affect on Facebook is partially to blame, or partially the cause of many of our current problems around toxic misinformation, conspiracism, and other problematic behavior on social media. So, the reacts were added in 2016. The like button itself was added in February 2009, right? And in both cases, they were presented as mechanisms for consumer choice. But in reality, they were, also a way to collect categorized data about user expression and sociality, not just about you, but also who you connect to, whose posts you like more, whose posts you are more or less attracted to. It's, of course, much easier to get users to provide structured data than to try to collect from other sources. And so that's what these reactions are. They're structured data about emotional expression. So, looking kind of at the landscape today, there are a number of ways to collect structured data about emotions, human emotions, right? You can collect physiological data, right, about the body, about heart rate or blood conductivity. Behavioral data, everything from eye tracking and the movement of the mouse to things like facial response. I would say most emotion recognition systems that are deployed as part of facial recognition and facial analysis systems are some combination of behavioral and physiological data. Structured mood data, like those reaction icons I just mentioned, and other similar things, right, like emoji or animated GIFs or other formats for that emotive expression. Semantic data, text words like love, haha, angry, sad, and various others. And then social interactional data that kind of combines all of these and understands the relationships between the people who are expressing these forms of data. It's important to note, right, that in some cases this data is structured by the user, is developed by the user. In some cases, it's collected without the user knowing or realizing. And so before we dig into the history of these technologies and how they connect to the present, a quick primer on theories of emotion, because I think this is important, and this is something that really shapes these conversations on social media platforms and more generally today. And this is a big discussion. If there are philosophers on the call, they can feel free to elaborate or correct me, but what in my estimation, right, this really comes down to whether we as thinkers and humans understand emotions primarily as motivations or evaluations, right? Are emotions things that push us to do certain actions, to take certain actions that we have little control over, or are emotions part of the broader kind of evaluative or cognitive structure of thinking and feeling? And this has a lot to do with a problem that the philosopher Freddie Prinze calls the problem of parts, right? There are a number of different kind of ways we express emotion, and emotions themselves are recognized to have many components: physiological, cognitive, behavioral, evaluative, right? So we know that emotions are complex. How do these parts fit together, and which part is the most important, right? Which do you consider the kind of overarching one? So motivational theories, or what are also sometimes called anti-intentionalist theories of emotion, have generally been heavily influenced by the work of the Princeton psychologist Sylvan Tompkins of the 1950s. These theories suggest, right, that human emotions can be read through universal expressions in the human face and body, and that they are relatively invariant across cultures, and that they can be, that they're hard to hide potentially, right? That they because they're motivating, they produce a kind of regular signature, even if somebody's trying to hide it. In the 1970s, Tompkins connected with a energetic and ambitious psychologist, Paul Ekman, who developed something called the facial action coding system, which claimed to be able to identify the specific muscle movements of the face that correlated to particular emotions and emotional expressions. So this is an image from that work, right? And this is an image of what Ekman thought was sort of the 5 basic emotions: sadness, happiness, anger, dismay, and surprise. And if they look familiar, it's because they should do, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Theories that understand emotions as evaluations or evaluative are more closely associated with cognitive psychology, although not entirely. And they see emotion and they see human feelings as part of the complex sets of information, right, that help us as humans navigate the world, right? So this quote from the sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, who did some of the pioneering work on the history of affective labor and actually coined the term emotional labor, I think is telling, right? It's this idea that every emotion has a signal function, right? That emotions are signals that are telling the body or telling the person something that they can incorporate into their broader mental framework. Okay, so now that I've given you like the literally like 3-minute description of emotion theory, let's switch to scene 2. So here's the second part of the question. So I've laid out the kind of lay of the land in terms of how emotion is broadly understood via digital technologies or in digital technologies. And so the kind of meat of my book project is kind of an answer to this question: how did Silicon Valley come to find it both conceivable and desirable, right, to develop these emotion technologies, and especially to develop this idea of emotional artificial intelligence, right? The idea that you could automate emotion in the context of AI, as well as the kind of collect data about emotion. And the project is too big to summarize here, but I want to start to lay out 3 broad themes from the book that will help contextualize my presentation today, and we'll sort of thread through to the present. These themes are as follows. The first is that computing technologies over the last 60 to 70 years have really reinforced existing quantifiable biophysical, biophysiological definitions of emotion. Definitions of emotion that really focus on the body, right, and focus not just on the body, but also focus on the involuntary actions of the body and of physiology. There are of course, other definitions of emotion that folks in computing have thought about and engaged with, but what I want to emphasize here is that computing technologies are taking up much older ideas, and in some ways taking up ideas that have been largely discredited or at least heavily complicated in biology, physiology, and other kind of related fields. The second point is that these kind of quantifiable biophysical definitions of emotion have tended to either directly or indirectly justified emotion and emotional control as both a proxy and mechanism for maintaining social norms. By this, I mean, right, that there's a much longer history about how emotion plays a part in the kind of broad ideologies of biopolitics, of colonialism, of misogyny, and of other these totalizing problematic things we generally don't like, and that the work of these scholars has sort of suggested, right, that emotional control is simultaneously a way to judge individuals for their social utility, but also a mechanism to maintain those hierarchies, right? So for instance, right, in the 19th century, the idea that non-white races had less ability to control their emotions, right, simultaneously meant that they were in these kind of racist scientific appraisals of the time, that these non-white people were less civilized, but also it was a mechanism to point to anybody who was emotionally, was not able to control their emotions as being in some way primitive or childish or atavistic, and thus needing correction or needing not needing to be taken seriously. And so finally, the final theme I want to highlight that will come up again and again through this project is this the way that these definitions have been and these mechanisms have been articulated is through the triangulation between animals, machines, and humans, right? And the ways in which the kind of selective use of these different entities, these different kinds of being, have allowed mostly white male experts to justify and reinforce those norms around control that I just mentioned. Okay, so let's dig into each of these themes in turn. So this idea of computing technologies reinforcing existing quantifiable biophysiological definitions of emotion. So this is something that is notable and apparent, that going back into the history not just of computer science but of cybernetics. So many of you may know, right, that the idea of homeostasis or self-regulated feedback, right, which is critical to the idea of cybernetic control that was applied after the Second World War to, to mechanical systems as well as to humans. The term homeostasis actually was coined by this man, Walter Bradford Cannon, who was a Harvard physiologist, one of the major leading physiologists of the 1920s and 30s, and a man who was extremely interested not just in emotion, but also in the ways in which the body was, could be articulated as being analogous to society. Right? So in this book, the famous book, The Wisdom of the Body, I published in like late 1920s. Cannon, talks a lot about the individual human body and its ability to remain homeostatic, to kind of fluctuate within parameters to, to kind of survive and thrive. But he also talks about the body politic. He talks about the kind of problems of dysregulated societies, and notably, he actually really, takes a swipe at the capitalists. This is again like on the eve of the Great Depression, and so Cannon is concerned, right, that excess wealth will dysregulate, and destabilize the kind of social body. But the idea of emotion as being a kind of physiological phenomenon goes back even before Cannon. It goes into the work of late 19th century physiologists, well documented by the historian of science Othniel Dror, who describes this idea of emotion as number, right? A kind of alternative medium for the circulation and expression of emotions. This was physiologists in Britain and the United States, especially, having a lot of trouble. Again, these were white male experts, articulating their emotions in the kind of prevailing social norms of the day, which understood emotion as being feminine, feminized, and sentimental. Right? This was, as Dror points out, even exacerbated by the fact that these male physiologists were constantly grappling with a new wave of anti-vivisection protesters and animal rights activists, who were deploying all sorts of emotional appeals to support the welfare of the animals that these male physiologists were doing experiments on. So the development of the ability to kind of find quantifiable measures of emotional expression through proxies such as blood pressure or skin conductivity or heart rate was both a means to produce a kind of scientific language of emotion through number, and also actually ended up being a means for these men to express their own emotional sociality to each other in a way that was sanctioned within the kind of dominant regimes of gendered affect at the time. So this idea of emotion of number carries through, of course, into the 1920s and 30s, and really permeates the work of Cannon and his associates at Harvard in ways that are extraordinarily influential on the history of computing, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm going to speed ahead a little bit here, because the person who probably did the most to associate kind of the kind of physiological signals with emotion is a figure who you may not have heard of unless maybe you've heard me talk, which is this man. This is Dr. Manfred Clynes. He is playing the piano, and Dr. Manfred Clynes was first and foremost in his own mind a concert pianist. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but emigrated with his family, and fled is a better word, to Melbourne, Australia in the late 1930s to escape the National Socialist governments of Austria and Germany. And as Clynes, he was a teenager. He worked in a canning factory, but very quickly showed a tremendous aptitude both for music and for mathematics. His father had been an engineer. And so to make a long story short, he both pursued a career as a concert pianist and studied at Juilliard in New York City, but also needed to pay the bills. For various reasons, concert pianism didn't do that, and so he began working on the development of analog computers in a company in New Jersey. He was found, he met there. He met a famous psychologist at the time, Dr. Nathan Klein, it's very confusing, Klein and Kleins, who was the head of the research unit at the Rockland State Mental Institution in upstate New York, a very large state mental institution. So Kleins went to work for Klein, and one of the things they did a few years later was approach the defense establishment with the request to aid the kind of American effort against the Soviets this is in the 1950s, and find some way to put their joint research on mechanical systems and digital systems and drugs, for Klein was himself a big psychopharmacologist, to work. The result of this collaboration was the coining of the term cyborg. So if you've heard of Manfred Kleins, it's probably because he was the one who coined or helped coin the term cyborg. And the cyborg, right, was a this man-machine hybrid, definitely, depicted in the cover in Life magazine in 1960. And using the kind of mechanical and computer engineering abilities of Klein's to pump various regulating drugs through the body of the astronaut to help humans survive in space. So you can see here how Klein's interest in the body, in the kind of mechanisms of the body, the mechanics of the body, predisposed him to be thinking about physiological signals and their meanings. And by the late 1960s, Klein's had begun to do this in the context of emotion. So he designed a special computer, a special purpose digital machine called the centigraph, pictured here, which measured a user's quote unquote centigrams, or longitudinal traces of pressure in 2 dimensions, through the pressure of the finger. And, Klein's actually thought that pressure was a less culturally contextual form of expression. He was aware of the problems of the fact that there's a cultural variation in things like emotional expression, and he wasn't convinced by the work of Paul Ekman, right, who had claimed that there were these 5 emotions and they could be seen on the face. He I think believed in strongly that there were universal emotions, but he didn't think the face was the best way to track them. So he developed the centigraph instead. And Klein's believed that he could capture reliably, the same brain pattern for distinct emotions if they, he would ask these users to visualize, to kind of try to feel and embody particular emotional states, and he would track these the kind of electric patterns in the brain that correlated to them. So these acentic patterns kind of capture the qualities for him of emotion that are precise, right? And one thing that connects this work to Klein's interest in music was his belief that musicians translated their dominant centigrams into their music, and so that's why we have on the slide this this image of various composers being played by various musicians, and the kind of claim that there's a kind of correlation between them. I'll say here too that Klein's pianism is critical to his work on emotion, because his understanding of himself as a romantic musical genius is another mechanism, another kind of hegemonically sanctioned way through which men could articulate and understand their own emotion. Right, Klein's emotion work was not popular. I mean, people thought he was crazy for even talking about emotion, right? And so it was really this connection for him between understanding the musical genius and the kind of emotional lives of great composers, romantic composers like Beethoven, that kind of gave him, I guess, his own kind of social and personal license to engage with these topics. And they weren't initially at all profitable. He was fired from this job at Rockland State. He was also an extraordinarily difficult and problematic person to work with, and subsequently returned to Australia for most of the 1970s and 80s. So we'll leave that first theme there. We'll leave this theme of physiology there. So back to the second theme, right? These biophysiological definitions justified emotional control as both proxy and mechanism for maintaining social norms. This is, in many ways, why cybernetics as a field got started in the first place. It wasn't just about the engineers and mathematicians and computers folks at MIT working on anti-aircraft trajectory monitorings. It was also social scientists like Lawrence K. Frank, writing in the 1910s and 20s and 30s about what he called the management of tensions, right? So Frank was an interesting figure. He was a sociologist, a kind of education person. He spent most of his career in big American foundations, directing their research funds, first Rockefeller and then the Macy Foundation, which you'll hear more about in a moment. And Frank was, kind of, I would say, kind of paragon of the late progressive era in American social policy. The progressive era, for those who don't know, right, was seen as a response to the kind of inhumane social conditions of the late 19th century, the kind of Dickensian working conditions and social conditions of the lower economic classes. And produced all sorts of potentially, salutary reforms, settlement houses, for education and family planning, things like, regulation on housing. But progressive era social reforms also had a very strong eugenic undertone, or maybe just overtone, right? Right. They were infused with the race science of the late 19th and early 20th century, and despite being interested in uplift for all, these progressive era thinkers often believed that some classes and groups of people were more easily uplifted than others, right? And so Frank is within this tradition, and without he's not sort of explicitly articulating explicitly racist views, but he is talking about how important it is to train and educate young people in proper emotional conduct, and connecting this kind of conduct with the kind of development of the normal psyche and the kind of well-adjusted psyche, and he kind of goes back and forth about to what extent your condition, your socioeconomic conditions, your upbringing has to do with this. So Frank considered himself a progressive, and in fact, most of the people I'm going to mention at the next slide did consider themselves progressives, including Frank's dear friend, the anthropologist Margaret Mead. Frank and Mead were friends, became friends in the late 1920s. They were bosom buddies. They lived together. Their families lived together. They vacationed together, and it was Frank and Mead who became really engaged through the Macy Foundation with something called psychosomatic medicine. Right, this idea that the body, right, that the physical conditions of the body were connected to mental states, and especially connected to emotion, to psychosis, to neurosis, to various kinds of emotional distress. It was at one of these meetings on these topics, like one of these kind of medical meetings involving a number of psychologists and social scientists, that the Mead and Frank and many other kind of social scientists of their circle first met the physiologists and mathematicians who had been thinking about homeostasis in the context of Walter Cannon's theories of the kind of biophysiological engagement of emotion. And it seems clear that Mead and Frank saw these scientists as sort of giving them the tools, the mechanisms, right, to manage social and emotional tensions more effectively, through the new sciences of computing, social control, and cybernetics. So here's an image of what became known as the cybernetics group, right, in a series of meetings after World War II. World War II kind of disrupted things. You had the bringing together of these social scientists and psychiatrists and sociologists with mathematicians and engineers and computer scientists While emotion was not always an explicit topic of the meetings, although it sometimes was, this question about the kind of management of the post-war order and the social management of the post-war order was omnipresent. There's some scholarship, there are different opinions about who had the upper hand in these meetings, right? The mathematicians were I think quite dismissive of a lot of the work of the social scientists involved in the Macy group. But I think it's notable, right, that it was social science that saw the value of these kind of technical mechanisms to try to advance a kind of supposedly or putatively progressive, but in many ways quite problematic project of liberal social norms. Okay, so we're going to fast forward a little bit because we're sticking on this theme about social tensions and social control, and we're going to fast forward to some people who, to their knowledge, probably don't think that they have anything to do with cybernetics at all. They might. These were the researchers working at the Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, Xerox PARC, which was a big research group that Xerox, at the time, one of the leaders in digital communication technologies, set up in the, I believe, 1960s, late 1960s, in Silicon Valley. And they set this up in part, to develop all sorts of innovations, and it also provided a kind of home for a bunch of cognitive scientists who wanted to do research, and with the excuse that it might be used as products. And so this in some ways, there's a whole way in which this legacy is also very cybernetic, but the key point here is that this is where a lot of the principles of what we now call human-computer interaction, right, the way that humans interact with computers, got developed, or at least initially developed. And what I want to flag here is the attitude towards the social, towards social control, and towards society that these authors, Stuart Card, Tom Moran, and Alan Newell, himself a big AI person, evinced towards in this work, in this is their big book at the time, The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction. And they say, right off the bat, a scientific psychology should not only help us to understand our own human affairs, or our own human nature, rather, but it should help us in our practical affairs. And what does that mean? Well, it means that psychology should be, should be used to shape, efficient work, right? Like through this figure, this is the kind of the what I call the PARC homunculus, this is the human computer interface, the kind of placidly smiling androgynous worker, androgynous only in this diagram. There's been some great work by a colleague of mine that charts how, of course, it was female office assistants who were doing all the actual research studies for these guys, who were then kind of written out of the ensuing text. But what I want to note, right, is this attitude towards the management of the social, right? The system designer is engaged in a sort of psychological civil engineering, trading computer parameters of human performance against cost and other engineering variables, right? So there's this idea of the direct manipulation, right, of the human variable within the computational system, right? At the time, it was a kind of desktop computer, with peripherals. As we'll see, right, we now have the kind of integration of the human as a kind of parameter into much more elaborate works of psychological civil engineering. And finally, just a few examples of the triangulation between humans, machines, and animals that we see around the reinforcement of some of these norms. I'm going to go kind of quickly through this because we don't have that much time. But right, I mean, all just to say, right, from even before the kind of Second World War, the robot, the artificial creature, the being was a figure of fascination. There's a whole history there. This is Electro, the Westinghouse Moto Man, at the 1939 World's Fair in Queens in New York. What's notable about Electro, the Westinghouse Moto Man, was that he told jokes, right? And his whole appeal was sort of to be kind of a wiseacre, which is interesting. But what I want to focus on here is the ways in which some of these ideas about emotion entered into kind of the personal computing market in the late 1980s and early 1990s, right? So, between basically, really between 1960 and 1990, emotion was essentially a kind of verboten topic in mainstream computer science. Nobody talked about it. Wasn't interesting. The cognitive and the rational reigned supreme. This began to change thanks to the work of this man, Joseph Bates, a man who he was a kind of child prodigy. He was interested in computer science and computing. He went to Carnegie Mellon, and he said that he wanted to create the kind of AI that he had dreamed about as a little kid. And the kind of AI he had dreamed about as a little kid was Rosie the robot, the fast talking maid on the Jetsons. And she had a strong personality, according to Bates. So Bates, created a research group at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. He was very interested and influenced by these kind of 1980s text-based adventure games, and also by the kind of vogue back then for virtual reality. And so he developed a whole system that was a way of building emotional agents, kind of standardizing and routinizing emotional cues into animated characters. He turned this into something called the Woggles. This is this kind of an animated instantiation of these principles, which was really influential in a variety of early 1990s consumer desktop applications, including something like Microsoft Bob, in this kind of animated interface. Again, Microsoft Bob, being a dog here. So so there's this way, the way in which it's you're constantly articulating emotion through non-human actors, partially for the needs of the graphics, but also I think because it it maintains that those kind of hierarchies of emotion that plays emotion as subservient to reason. Right, the Woggles were these kind of animated floating balls, and somebody involved in the project went on to found the very successful Pets video game series, dogs, cats, etc. At the same time, sort of across town, or at least across the Appalachians, Rosalind W. Picard, was at MIT, was also working on emotion, and one notable thing to say about Bates and his work was that it was heavily funded by Fujitsu, who was very interested in the work in competing around things like Tamagotchis. So these kind of Japanese toys, these kind of virtual pets. Picard was also really interested in some ways in the use of large amounts of video and kind of entertainment data. She was a faculty at the MIT Media Lab, which had a lot of connections with with kind of big media and also kind of experimental media. And so through these connections, Picard began to think about not just about perception as being a cognitive mechanism, but also emotion as being, centered on emotion. Picard has been, kind of articulated what she felt were the challenges of working on emotion as a woman in computer science. But she worked closely with Gloriana Davenport, who is a filmmaker and one of the founders of the Media Lab and its interactive cinema group, So essentially, in both cases, both Bates and Picard were interested in, how to manage the large amounts of kind of digital content that was being produced, and potentially organized, in the kind of industrial entertainment complex. So that's the sort of genesis of where we get the company Affectiva, which was heavily influenced also by Kleins's work to kind of create more mainstream ways of measuring physiological data, including from the face, as emotional proxies. Okay, so I've given you a whole kind of kaleidoscope of scenes, kind of tracing how all these ideas have gotten to the present. And I guess the question, of course, is so what? Why do we care about all this? And I think in some ways that that we can care about this on multiple levels, We can think about this at a kind of methodological or historiographic level, that we can kind of ground histories of technical advances in computing in their broader socioeconomic and cultural contexts, right? So, this is kind of this is sort of the kind of the big picture, right? This is the kind of neoliberalization and globalization of the service and entertainment economy in the 80s and 90s, is what brought all of these kind of disparate trends around how to understand emotion into mainstream computer science, right? They've been floating around. They came from psychology from the 1920s, like 100 years before, but they kind of get imported without perhaps all that much modification into kind of the tech economy of the 2010s, let's say. The other thing to say, right, is that it underscores how these intertwining older logics of social control, kind of gets connected with these commercial logics of the digitally mediated economy, right? So which of course have lots of other connections, right? These folks, at MIT and Carnegie Mellon weren't initially trying to control anybody, but they plugged into these larger themes that I think they were often not entirely aware they were part of. And this gets expressed in lots of different ways, right? So, here I was saying, these reaction icons should look familiar, right? So we have this kind of direct relationship between the basic emotion theory of Paul Ekman and the reaction icons of Facebook. Ekman's company and sort of related scholars consulted with both Facebook and also with Pixar on the 2015 film Inside Out to kind of sort of kind of develop these ideas. So this basic emotion theory, even though it's now been quite contested by other scholars in psychology, is really baked into a lot of the infrastructure of digital media and our imaginaries of what digital media is about. We also have continuing ways in which animation and the animation of the animals gets deployed in kind of the social and emotional engagement of social media networks, right? So this is from 2017, the development of animojis, right, for Apple. These kind of animated, what I call privacy loss leaders, right? Getting you to use the facial recognition technology in your phone to create these cute animals, which of course Mark Zuckerberg wants you to want to extend to creating tightly, highly photorealistic avatars for his purported metaverse, right? Avatars that require minute biophysiological surveillance of the face and body. And then we have the sequence of kind of the kind of emotional AI, right? We've got the figure of Sophia, the highly gendered quote unquote AI robot, a kind of publicity stunt, sort of suggesting a human face to quite literally to artificial intelligence. When the reality of AI, of course, is the mobilization of emotion data for all sorts of other purposes, like selling people things, right? So using kind of the insights about mood for Facebook users to attempt to to increase their buying power, to to track and evaluate people in various contexts, including in education and in hiring, right? And this is the point, right, to say that these technologies, on top of all these other problems, are also not immune to the broader issues facing, bias in AI systems. So Lauren Rue at University of Maryland has shown that facial recognition systems often struggle to interpret the emotions of Black faces. For instance, right, both of these men are smiling. These are both college athletes' videos. They've been told to smile, and yet, at the time, the emotion recognition system is able to, understands the white face is smiling and the Black face is not. And finally, and I'm only kind of going to gesture at this here because I'm running out of time, right? We have this broader question about the kind of management of tensions, or the inflating of tensions, right? The kind of modulation of social control, or the modulation of division, as articulated through social media platforms, right? So Michael Kaczynski, one of the figures at the center of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, said, right, at the time, that a smartphone is a vast psychological questionnaire that we are constantly filling in, both consciously and unconsciously. That's psychological civil engineering, right? That's come to fruition with fairly horrifying effects that in the past and also continuing. So that's kind of a kind of overview of the themes of the book. I put in a plug as a historian. This is why I think the history of computing is absolutely essential to conversations today about the social and ethical impacts of digital technologies like AI and their potential regulation and curtailment. And I want to thank you all for being such a great audience, and I'm happy to answer some questions and can stay a little past 7 if need be.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, I think we're going to go till around 7:15, I think was the time, unless you actually have to dash.
No, I don't. I'm great.
But,
I'm
okay,
happy to
cool.
chat.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I see that there's already a question. I'm just going, while folks are writing in their questions, I'm just going to start us off with one, which is you've given us this beautiful history kind of laying out how AI, emotions, and cybernetics are interwoven. And then you, of course, wrapped up with what we're currently experiencing. I'm wondering where you see this going in the future. Obviously, it's always a challenge to try to predict the future, but do you see there being more pushback towards these technologies, or do you see the development of more of these technologies? Like, what do you anticipate?
Yeah, I think that one strand of digital technologies is really interested in a even more granular kind of tracking and potentially manipulation of of emotions, in as much as it's like really trying to understand and believes in the link between the exterior expression of emotional states and something kind of innate about the interiority of people, right? So so like the metaverse stuff, right? So Mark Zuckerberg, wanting these photorealistic avatars, right? That's one example. Another example is the kind of horror that is Neuralink, right? Elon Musk's kind of direct to the brain. There's a kind of belief by a lot of technologists that if you could just get into the brain, and get those brain signals, you would like be able to kind of like pinpoint emotionality. And I think, which is what Klein's wanted to do. Klein's did this without invasive surgery. But of course, what Klein's was doing was asking people to think discreetly about, like, he was asking people to do a thing and simulate like their to like kind of muster up some sort of response, which is kind of not this maybe the same thing as emoting or in a kind of in a non-controlled way. So I think that's one big trend. I think that the kind of general thesis of the book, right, is that emotions are useful for computer science because they seem to provide us a proxy for social relations, right? They're something that they're not easily or well measured, but they are something that can be measured, right? And so I think, as computer science continues to kind of be interested in social relations, I think that will continue.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sarah, do you want to read Ishnish's question?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ushnish, one of the attendees, says, of the various historical threads identified, is there a turning point or a major choice made in the application of emotion to technology that was the greatest leverage point for taking a fairer and more just path?
That's a really good question. It's always hard for a historian to pick one leverage point. I think when we say fairer or more just here, I mean, I think one way I read that is more cognizant of the challenges of engaging with emotion as a quantifiable thing. And so there are different ways to understand fair and just, right? I mean, none of this is fair and just in lots of ways. What I'm thinking of here is that at the cybernetics meetings in 1952, there was a whole meeting about emotions, about the quantification of emotion, the kind of digital proxy for emotion. And Julian Bigelow, who was one of the original authors of the first paper about cybernetics, he was an electrical engineer, and by my read, a fairly sensible guy. He was like, what are we talking about? You don't know what emotions are. You haven't been able to define pinpoint them in the brain. You know, there are all these problems, there are all these parts to emotions. Why are we talking about quantifying them at all? Right? This is kind of sophistry. He uses the word sophistry, and I wish, you know, the ensuing kind of decades of work had kind of like seen that, been aware of that warning, and had taken it to heart. Because I think in many cases this is sophistry, right? And it ties into the kind of broader trend of resurrecting what I think are explicitly kind of often physiognomic or phrenologic logics, right? This idea that you can infer things about people from their internal things about people from their external presentation in a reliable way, right? Using computers. I think this is like one of the great problems of our time, and I think I wish they'd listen to Julian Bigelow.
Thank you, Luke. The next question comes from ML, who writes, I'm wondering if you could speak to how language might have been used as a quantifiable proxies for emotion in addition to emojis or facial tracking.
Yeah, so the history of using language as a proxy is super interesting, and I get into it a little bit in the book. One thing to say, right, is that all of these different kind of forms of expressible data have been used. I don't talk about sound at all, about the voice in the book, or very little. My colleague and friend Beth Semmel at MIT does a great job on that. She has a whole project on audio and the voice and psychology. But yeah, so interestingly, the history of machine learning, right, as a set of AI techniques, pattern recognition, does connect at a quite early stage to emotion. The kind of automated reading of suicide notes is like an interesting case in the 1960s where people are trying to use machine learning to find patterns in these documents. And so there's a kind of, I think basically this work happens in the 1990s, I think it is. I have written about this, where basically, you know, you develop so the psychologists are kind of developing dictionaries to kind of go along with their scales for kind of you know, articulating various flavors of emotion, and those scales get built into things like sentiment analysis.
Awesome, thanks. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, so Robert says, you briefly mentioned disinformation at the beginning of the presentation. What role do you see for affective computing / AI in spreading disinformation? Are recommendation algorithms key in this, in your view?
Yes, I think so. Without, you know, without kind of the kind of in-depth kind of insights into the specifics of various platforms systems, it can sometimes be hard to know how things get weighted, what proxies are being used for what, right? And there's been a lot of discussion about this, right? There's been a lot of debate about is it the affordance, is it the platforms that's kind of the chief cause? Is it, you know, is it social, you know, is it the social, you know, you know, there's been great work on YouTube, you know, pointing out that it's not just the algorithm that sucks people into kind of right-wing disinformation. It's you know, it's kind of the active, the kind of the strategies of content creators who are trying to kind of, you know, engage with the kind of affordances of the platform themselves. So it's both. But I do think that in an attention economy, I think for that, you know, whether they mean to or not, platforms will, you know, will find ways to keep people's attention, and because emotions are so tightly tied to identity, to sense of self, to sense of community, right? Those are powerful ways to connect people's attention and keep people's attention. And so I think that's, you know, I mean, just, you know, almost despite itself, I don't think Facebook wants to be producing, they don't want to be producing these like problematic things. Elon Musk, I think, does want to produce these effects, which is a real problem, but they happen anyway.
The next question kind of tails off of that a bit. Giselle writes, do you think emotional aware recommender systems are the right move where the systems promote news products according to the user's emotions? Can you think about any ethical problems about collecting online emotions?
Yeah, I think in fact, these are a terrible idea. I'm generally pretty against any emotion tracking or detection in almost all cases. Because I think, right, because again, right, and I'll just underscore this, what these systems are tracking is not, technically speaking, emotion, right? It's certain physiological proxies that we might interpret as emotional expression, but we, even humans, don't always interpret them very well. And these technical systems also don't necessarily interpret them very well. So I think, right, and I think, there's a kind of dynamic recursion that happens, right, where the more people are very flexible, right? They end up starting to shape their behavior and their actions to fit the system, using the affordances that are available. And so I think that's what I worry about the most across different media and different platforms is, people sort of reshaping their behavior to kind of make use of these formats. Of course, they're not doing it. They're doing it with some agency, and they're doing it in different ways in different parts of the world. There's a little bit of interesting work, and I'd love to see more on the kind of regional variation, cultural variation of the use of some of these formats, because it does vary. And I think people find, I think there's a real North American kind of Anglosphere centricness to the way that Facebook, for instance, deploys reactions. So I think there's an ethical issue with all of it, and I have a paper from a couple of years ago with a computer scientist that kind of lays that out. I think especially, right, with basic emotion theory, right, the idea that the kind of fundamental idea that emotions are motivational, right, has a kind of anti-agentic quality, which I think is just wrong on the science, but I think believing it and acting as if it's true further underscores some of these really problematic existing narratives around hierarchies of people.
Great. So the next question is from Chris. Thank you very much, Dr. Stark. Very fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between using technology to identify existing emotions versus using technology to create emotion. It seems as though we can't have one without the other, yet we seem to accept that many technologies we use are manipulating our emotions with precision, even if we don't believe they are able to adequately assess our emotional responses yet.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that people aren't accepting it. I think people may be resigned to kind of these manipulations. And there's certainly, there's lots of great study and social work on social media that, that talks about the ways that users, again, they're constantly trying to, like, gaming platforms is not the best phrase, but are constantly interacting with and learning about and trying to exert power over a platform. I was actually just talking about this with my students today. Right, I mean, influencers are a good example, right? Influencers are with very little information are constantly trying to figure out how to get more exposure, how to sell their products, right? I mean, so I would like there to be less acquiescence or kind of acceptance, and I think that's part of why I do what I do, I guess. And that of course, I mean, the problem of the manipulation of public opinion is a very old topic in media studies, right? It goes, propaganda as a kind of discipline, goes back basically to the beginnings of mass media, right? To the First World War, right? To kind of organize mass media campaigns. And so I think there's a lot to say, between kind of social media work and that longer history of work on propaganda. I mean, I think, it's, on the one hand, right? I mean, I think we balance the fact that we do have agency. On the other hand, right? We, look, people make history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing. People act, but often not under the kind of emotional, I don't know, the kind of the vibe of their own choosing, right? The fact that we use the word vibe now, which is very related to kind of feelings, is interesting. Right. So yeah. So like yeah. I mean, like the kind of the tone of. I mean, look. I mean, people talk about after September 11th as being a good example, right? Like the kind of emotional the emotional tone of propaganda works. If you've got like particular emotions coming at you from various forms of media, like it rubs off even on people who are very very sensitive.
Thanks, Luke. The next question comes from Juan, who also thanks you for your talk. And Juan writes, how do you see that the current hype in generative models might have an impact on the rise of emotion technologies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the language model stuff, large language models, ChatGPT, a colleague has talked about this, Kareem Carr on Twitter has talked about this as auto suggest on steroids, right? And so, one of the critiques of these models, this is from the Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell, Timnit Gebru paper that got Timnit and Margaret fired, right? Was the kind of subtle way that large language models, reflect a hegemonic or dominant worldview, right? So, whatever the kind of hegemonic and dominant worldview about a topic is in the data collected by the language model is probably going to reproduce that, or will be inclined to reproduce that. So I think that's a problem, right? Especially given right, like what text is on the web, and also the kind of prevailing norms, the kind of history of emotion norms in Western society, right? Which are, which position men as rational and women as emotional, that position emotionality, kind of simultaneously, right? Like, so it's kind of, it's both. Like certain kinds of emotion, you show you're weak, other kinds of emotion are acceptable, right? We have this problem now where like white men think their anger is totally justified and the most important emotion in the world, right? So that's those norms which get reflected in things like in like large language models, even even if there are attempts to kind of correct that or mitigate that, it's still a kind of overarching problem.
Thank you so much. Really interesting discussion. Robert writes, this may be a little distanced from your historical research, but are you aware of whether Canada has much in the way of consumer protection policy / regulation for affect-based recommendation and marketing algorithms?
It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but to my knowledge, no. And I think actually there really isn't a lot of legislation actually anywhere. There is some. So the European Union's AI Act kind of deals with some of this stuff because emotion is a protected category of data collection. But in terms of the actual affect-based recommendation, no. I mean, affect kind of comes up, but it comes up interstitially in some of these points. And Canada, right, we have kind of a real lag on a lot of AI regulation, right? The federal government has this bill that they just announced earlier in the year that seems extremely vague and it's not clear what's going to be in it. So no, I mean, right. So how this gets covered under Canadian regulation largely is through privacy law, right? Through either the kind of public sector privacy laws or PIPEDA, which is the private sector privacy law. But I don't think they explicitly talk about emotion.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. If you had a question, I'm also going to invite, and also no pressure if you don't, but I'm also going to invite people in attendance. We have a few more minutes if you want to ask additional questions. I mean, Luke has already answered so many, already answered 8 questions, but just we'll like give folks a couple more minutes.
Yeah, but, sure. Yeah.
Sarah, did you have?
Yeah, so forgive if this is left field because AI is so far away from like what I work on, but it's really like so interesting to me. I was just wondering like how you feel being a historian approaching these topics, and like is that how you kind of self-define in conversations about policy or anything like that? Just like what are the strengths and positioning that kind of come with being a historian working on things that are like not even just now but very future oriented?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I'm a little conflicted. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I often describe my work as I describe myself as having a historian's hat and a non-historian's hat. And I guess that helps people be like, oh, that's, but they're really very related, these topics. And I kind of left history as a discipline. I mean, I did an interdisciplinary PhD, and I have not worked in a history department since, because I wanted to make those connections between the present and the past. And I you see historians making those connections. The really good historians, and yet the discipline as a rule seems to shy away from them often. So I see a lot of utility there. One of the things that I say sort of, I don't believe, right, I don't believe in like mining history for useful insights about the present and future. That's not what, I mean, somebody talked, I was at a workshop about this one, about history and computing, and somebody kind of was very enthusiastic about that. I was like, that's not the point. But one of the things that historical research and historical training gives you is a sense of sometimes of what is new and what isn't new, right? What themes are repeating, where the themes start, where they arise in various histories. And and of course, like the technical mechanisms, the kind of increased computing power is new, right? Like we just have right, but a lot of the ideas and problems around emotion, for instance, are not new. So if you read the Macy Conference transcripts, the conversation they have in 1952 about emotion and the kind of quantification of emotion and technology, digital media, is, I would say, as sophisticated as the conversations we're having today, right? They hit all the problems. They see all the issues. Julian Bigelow has this whole thing, why are we doing this at all? And then it kind of disappears. And then there's this kind of lull, and now we're back to the same spot. So that's one way I articulate my utility. I think, and I put this on the screen. This is this book. This is called The Impact of Computers on Society and Ethics of Bibliography. This is a book that was published it was published before 1977, because it's in the program of the West Coast Computer Fair, which happened in 1977. And this, it's 128 pages just a bibliography of all the papers that have something to do with society and ethics on computer science. 1977, right? So what this part says is that these conversations will keep happening over and over and over again. One irritating thing about digital technology is every time some new thing comes in, there's a collective amnesia on the part of especially its boosters, that like all the bad things about the previous iteration, like, gone. Personal computers were, in the 80s, people had issues with them. All of a sudden, it's the World Wide Web. All the personal computing problems are gone. We got the World Wide Web. Social media, the World Wide Web, it's right. So there's this kind of like, right, there's this perpetual renewal of the promise of these technologies in the eyes of their boosters for obvious reasons. So I think, drawing on that long genealogy is helpful in some ways because, as folks have pointed out, computer scientists are often they tend to be interested in the kind of, history of institutions. Like they like they like that kind of like, oh, and then this happened and this happened, right? And so that's one way to get a little bit of a grip. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Great question.
Awesome. And no one else wrote in any new questions, and we're around 7:15. So I think we can wrap up if there's any like final thing you want to say to leave people with, but sometimes that's a bit of a big ask to try to summarize.
Yeah, no, I think, this is interesting work to me, and I'm glad other folks are interested. Happy to connect on various platforms, and wish me luck for the rest finishing the book.
Yeah, good luck, Luke. And thank you everyone for coming. Again, remember we have, I think it's 5 more events coming up this winter term. So we hope you join us at them. And thank you so much for our captioner, Michelle. Thank you, Sarah, for doing the tech. And of course, thank you, Luke, for your wonderful presentation. So please continue to come to our events. We'd love to have you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.